Good afternoon, welcome to Medyascope TV. Today we'll try to shed some light on the many myths and realities associated with the many Syrians living in Turkey. And this interview actually comes at a time when hate crimes against the Syrians living in Turkey have almost skyrocketed. The whole country was shocked to wake up to reports of a pregnant Syrian woman being raped, kidnapped, and murdered this morning alongside her 10-month-old baby. We're joined by Omar Kadkoy, who is a research associate at the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey in Ankara. Welcome, Mr. Kadkoy.
Thank you very much.
So for starters, let's talk about some basic facts and numbers. Can you tell us how many Syrians are estimated to be living in Turkey at the moment, and what are their different legal statuses, and what percentage of the Syrians living in Turkey are currently employed in the workforce?
Certainly. Thank you very much for having me again on your show. As of June 29th, the Directorate General of Migration Management said that there are 3.06 million Syrians living in Turkey. Now, all of these Syrians, the legal status of these Syrians is regulated under something called the temporary protection status. And as you said, like if we want to talk about some basic statistics, the 3.06 million Syrians basically are living in all of the provinces in Turkey. They have an urban lifestyle, and only 8% of them live in the government-run camps in the south or southeast region of Turkey. And of those 3 million Syrians, we have 53% of them males, and we have 47% of them women. Now, most importantly, almost 1/3 of the Syrians living in Turkey are below 18, and there are around 870,000 Syrians in the school age, and 56% of those kids are enrolled in schools, either in public Turkish schools or in temporary education centers, and the remaining percentage, which is around 44%, are still out of school.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Kadkoy, as you know, the two main anti-Syrian arguments that have fueled debate recently were focused on crime rates and employment. But since your work at TEPAV focuses specifically on the labor market integration of Syrians, we'll keep our focus on that. Can you explain to us what the legal working rights of the Syrians are in Turkey? Who is permitted to work, who isn't, and under what conditions?
Certainly. The 3 million Syrians, as I said, have the legal status of temporary protection, which is in force since October 2014. Before that, Syrians were referred to as guests. And actually, this is something we still hear quite often, that Syrians are our guests. However, the legal status, since it got into force in October 2014, provided Syrians access with the basic provisions of health and education services. And it was only January last year when the government issued a law allowing Syrians to formally access the labor market. Since the issuance of the law, there has been, and there is still actually, a misunderstanding between both Syrians and employers. And I will briefly explain how the work permit law, or like how the access to the labor market basically works. So for starters, it is the employer's duty to apply for the work permit when employing a Syrian after signing a contract with that employee. And this application is submitted via an online portal for the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. However, before the submission of that application, there's a waiting period of 4 weeks where the employer should state that there wasn't any local or citizen of Turkey with a set of skills to fill that vacancy, basically. The second thing is that Syrians under temporary protection, they cannot be employed unless they have been registered under the temporary protection status for 6 months at least. So this is the second point. Thirdly, the number of Syrians under temporary protection cannot exceed 10% of the labor force at any workplace. Fourth, they are paid the minimum wage, which is they cannot be paid below the minimum wage, which today stands at $424. Finally, Syrians are allowed only to work in the provinces they are registered in, and there is one amendment as well at the end of this point that says Syrians who work in seasonal jobs, that is husbandry and agriculture, the employers of those Syrians are exempt from issuing work permits for them. So if we look now at the number of work permits that have been issued for Syrians under temporary protection over the course of 2016, the number stands at 13,000. And in the first 2 months of this year, by the end of February 2017, another 5,000 work permits were issued for Syrians under temporary protection. Now, unfortunately, we do not know how many of the work permits that had been issued in 2016 were renewed for this year, because this is something is not publicly disclosed, actually. So if we consider this number, the 13,000 work permits issued last year, this would tell us that, unfortunately, less than 1% of Syrians in the working age are working formally in the labor market here in Turkey. Therefore, the majority of Syrians who work, they do so in the informal market and in a very dear conditions.
Mm-hmm. As you've also explained very clearly in your response, how Syrians can and cannot work in Turkey is in fact laid out by laws and regulations, and you also quote some of these regulations in your latest Turkish Policy Quarterly article with Selim Koru, and you definitely underline that Turkish employers aren't actually allowed to have more than 10% of their labor force to be Syrian. But my question to you is, are these regulations really being followed closely by Turkish employers, or can we talk about a widespread violation of these rules and regulations for the sake of decreasing labor costs? My actual question to you is, do you think these violations are paving the way for the incitement of further hatred against Syrians in Turkey?
Yeah, this is a very good point, actually. The 10% quota is actually flexible, and it is bendable when the demand for especially the local employees, here I'm talking about Turks specifically, exceeds the supply of available workers, actually. That's when the 10% quota can be bended and more Syrians can be employed. This is actually a reality in certain provinces with certain Syrian entrepreneurs or businessmen who moved their web of relations and reestablished their businesses again here in Turkey. So the 10% quota is not as rigid as it sounds. However, when the dynamics exist to bend that rule, the local authorities are very cooperative to do so. But let me tell you this one thing as well. Today in Turkey, we have 1.4 million businesses registered at the Union Chambers of Commerce and Commodity Exchanges. So, unfortunately, we do not have an effective mechanism to control and do regular checkups on the employment dynamics with all of these 1.4 million businesses. Consequently, this means that Syrians become the weaker link in employment because actually two very clear reasons. One, the poor command of the Turkish language, and the second one is the unaccredited professional and educational skills they have. So these factors combined together leave Syrians to be exploited by the private sector or the employers, basically. And we also should know that, considering the size of the businesses, as I mentioned before, illegal employment is not something only related to Syrians. Also, locals suffer from such a thing. But I want to emphasize specifically on the lack of mechanisms to monitor the legality and illegality of employing Syrians and locals in any workshop or any workplace. But I want to also remind you about a very important point. Syrians do not only exist on the demand side of employment, they also exist on the supply side. Here I'm talking about the Syrian entrepreneurs. Between 2011 until April 2017, there have been 6,000 establishments set by or partnered by Syrian businesses. So when we look at the geographic location of these businesses, they are largely located in the southeast region, where 35% of Syrians are already residing. And also that region, even prior to the influx of Syrians, suffered from employment rates higher than the average national rate. So if we manage to support these Syrian entrepreneurs and integrate them into the local supply chain, they could actually serve as an integration vessel for Syrians into the local community. And also, they can provide jobs for the locals themselves, because after all, Syrian entrepreneurs, they come with certain expertise and certain know-how. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a new market for them, and they will definitely be keen on hiring and benefiting from the skills and the knowledge of the local workforce.
Mm-hmm. One of the most visible reasons why there's a general anti-Syrian sentiment among the Turkish workforce and local population is actually about the demand side. You've explained very clearly that Syrians exist on the supply side as well, but this is where the debate happens to be focused on. So one of the most visible arguments against Syrians holds that Syrians are taking Turkish people's jobs, basically. And in fact, Deputy Prime Minister Veysi Kaynak said on Wednesday, and I quote, "If there were no Syrians in cities such as Kahramanmaraş, Adana, Osmaniye, Gaziantep, and Ankara, our factories would stop working. No one else wants these jobs." So in this case, how should we make sense of this situation? Are Syrian workers really taking Turkish people's jobs because of their cheaper labor costs that they provide to the employers, or are these jobs no longer wanted by Turks? Let me reformulate the question. Is it fair to say that Syrians are opting in for the exploitation that Turks no longer tolerate?
Let me tell you that research tell us that these two statements are correct. On the one hand, the influx of Syrians to Turkey in early 2011 created a supply shock in the labor market. And the competition especially increased or materialized in low-skilled jobs. And women and the youth were among the most affected groups of such a competition. But this certainly, this replacement or unemployment, especially in regions where Syrians densely reside, it adds to the social tension, and maybe what we are seeing now could be one way or another related to this thing. But however, the international data tells us that cultural diversity actually is very good for economic growth. When we look at the numbers between the 1960s to 2010, we see that an increase of 10% in cultural diversity leads to, let me be accurate here, to 2.1 percentage growth in gross domestic production per capita. And in developing countries, this percentage goes up to 2.8. So actually, the impact or the negative impact created in the labor market is certainly of a short-term nature, and the long-term, the literature at least tells us that the long-term impact of immigrants or refugees has a positive impact on the labor market. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, a recent research showed that manufacturing and agriculture sectors are not attracting or not appealing to the locals anymore. And when we look at the educational background of Syrians in Turkey, we find that 80% of them have 8 or less years or fewer years of education. So this means they are not well educated, and the jobs available in the manufacturing and agricultural sectors require low-skilled jobs to fill the gap. And Syrians could do so and bridge this gap. But here we also need to emphasize or elaborate on the point that considering their educational backgrounds, we should provide them with the necessary vocational education courses and certificates, along with comprehensive Turkish classes, so they can jump in and fill this gap where they can complement the absence of locals, and consequently, the citizens of Turkey who are not willing to work in the labor-intense sectors, they can maybe look for the service sector and maybe have or land better jobs in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Kadkoy, another area another area where a lot of misinformation seems to be spreading is the benefits provided by the Turkish government to the Syrians living here. So in order to counter the myths related to this, can you summarize what sort of public benefits and allocations are given to the Syrians living in Turkey?
Certainly. The legal status of Syrians, which is the temporary protection, provides Syrians with access to the basic provisions of education and health. And I want to specifically talk about the health services, which are really stretched by Syrians, and especially in the south and southeast region. And to actually ease the pressure and to ensure an equal quality of the services provided for both Syrians and the locals, the World Health Organization, in cooperation with the Ministry of Health, they are training and certifying Syrian health professionals. I'm talking about here doctors and nurses, so they can obtain a certain knowledge of the system that works here in the health sector. And once they finish their training and they attend the required courses, they are certified to work in refugee health centers and units to serve Syrians specifically. So this way we can ensure that the benefits provided by the government are met with the desired quality by both locals and Syrians, and we could not see any clashes or social tension resulting because of any exaggerated benefits provided by the government. Also, we all heard that or read about the Syrians standing in queue and like getting salaries from the government or whatever it is, and those are actually all false news, because whatever cash assistance Syrians receive is donated by the international community and executed on the ground by either international NGOs or local NGOs with the cooperation of certain public institutions. So here I'm talking about any cash scheme that could occur or happen on the ground is certainly provided by the international community as donations to help Syrians meet the hard conditions they are living through. But beside this, the government only provides health and education services for both the locals and the Syrians.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Kadkoy, my final question to you is about the troubles faced by the Syrian population living here in Turkey. And through the national media, we're used to hearing the problems and complaints by the local population about the Syrians living in Turkey, but we rarely hear about the complaints of the Syrian population living here. So can you tell us what the main problems and complaints of the Syrians living here are?
Yeah, let me finish with the following point. Prior to 2011, the concept of globalization here in Turkey was about sending and receiving goods from abroad. Then in 2011 until today, we have others residing in your neighborhoods, basically in every province. Here I'm talking about the Syrians and their urban nature of living. And now you can hear a language in the streets, and you read signs in the shops, on the shops, that you cannot understand. Consequently, Syrians came to a country where it is not easy to organize someone's life in a comfortable manner. And also, like for Syrians here in Turkey, it's everything is in Turkish except for a Latin alphabet. So these conditions are very new experiences for both the average Turk and the average Syrian. But this does not mean that we should let the recent tension or negativity spreading over the social and media outlets to force us to shape or form opinions of narrow perspective. I would say that what has happened recently is something sad. However, it happened on ad hoc levels and in a very scarce and spread provinces. So I would say things would heal itself, but we should also remain positive and look at the filled half of the glass rather than the empty one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Mr. Kadkoy, for this interview.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching. Goodbye.